Hello and most welcome to Heidegger 762. And we are once more recording here in Vårgårda, about 70 kilometers from Gothenburg, and we have a little sunshine actually. Well, it's coming and going, and it's thanks to it being a very windy day. We have some high temperature, and as usual those gives windiness. And I will take a little citation from the very nice book by Matthew King, Heidegger and Happiness. It's a tough read, but it's well worth it because it made me come to the understanding what is erasure, what is this crossing out of something. Why is it happening? Why is it done? So listen carefully. First time since I started with Heidegger, I will have something to say. It starts actually, I will not cite directly, but there is a new spelling of sign. He goes from the regular German spelling of sign to this one, using a Y. And this is the first indication that there is something happening. This is late in the career of Heidegger, and we discussed earlier, and that actually came as a clue. What happened? What was Heidegger looking for? And my argument today is that Heidegger came to the conclusion without knowing it consciously. He did it on paper. And this is something the very good interpreter of Heidegger, Graham Priest, also thought. Would Heidegger come to the conclusion par consistent logic, he would have solved the problem. But he had actually solved the problem already. So that's a partition there. He wasn't aware of it, but by doing it, it was already done. I will read a cite here from page 42 from the book. And this is a continuation. For the general public, Heidegger writes Sein in an ordinary spelling throughout his career. Though, as we discovered, where we compare, for instance, the published text of Einführung in die Metaphysik with the manuscript pages appended to Gesamtausgabe version, or the version of the lecture Die Kehre. Die Kehre is his turn, which he makes late in life, late in his career. Could you possibly heighten it a little bit more? Yeah, cheers. And this is published in the Gesamtausgabe. With the one published in Heidegger's lifetime. Heidegger sometimes writes Sein in his manuscripts, where Sein appears in official publication. So he kept mostly this one, for exception of the Gesamtausgabe, to himself. And I think that's a very good indication what's happening. He came to the conclusion by his hand, and I think that is very typical. We do understanding. We don't do understanding from within. And that realization really struck me. Heidegger had understood, but he did it with his hand. We do understanding. We mentioned before that words are actions, whereas also objects. We do the understanding. The fact, Matthew King continues, that Heidegger says Sein to others, where he says Sein with a Y to himself, goes to show that his remarks about the language of metaphysics, in parenthesis, and the inherently metaphysical nature of Western languages. That is the pending point. Don't forget that. The metaphysical nature of Western languages. I'm going to write that up. Because if you forget that, you will never understand. This is already established. The metaphysical I just write C, Western languages. So this is one of the things that makes it more difficult, because this remark does not pertain to his philosophy only. It pertains to everything. So you can't understand that if you think it has something to do with Heidegger's philosophy. It has not. It has to do with everything you do. That's the ground for understanding. You are already in this. You have always already been in this, in the metaphysical character of the Western languages. This is our inheritance. And this is part of the project of Heidegger, to show that we are already using metaphysical language in the present, in everyday language. In every instance, I would say from the moment you wake up to the moment you go to bed, but I would say it has also affect you at night. You are the metaphysical language of the Western tradition. I will actually take this up later in the second lecture of the day, if I dare have it, but prana, maybe, I promise. I don't want to burn myself out, but I'm very tempted. It should not be taken to mean that what he wants to say requires another language. Indeed, his own other language in order to be said at all. As we are about to see, this could not be the case, given Heidegger's view of language. Still, what Heidegger wants to say can be said more evocatively in that other language, as long as that other language says anything to us at all, which, unless we are prepared to hear it properly, it will not, and so Heidegger keeps it to himself while preparing us for it. Again, simply telling us how to hear it will not work. So no explicit thing will work in this case. It cannot be told. It cannot be explained, because it's in your language already. So every explanation will infer to you the metaphysical character of the Western languages. And that's an important point. At the time of the letter, Heidegger was only just beginning this process. This is the beginning of the Kehre, the turn. I'll write that up as began. Good to know, not extremely important, but he turned Heidegger. Thus, in the further marginal notes to the letter, we find bits of text translated onto the other language, as for instance, the word being is glossed as ereignis, or as crossed over, like this. And where the letter says that thinking is of being inasmuch as thinking where the letter says that thinking, in citation mark, is of being inasmuch as thinking, appropriated ereignet, by being, belongs to being. Very tough sentence. Heidegger comments that this is only a pointer in the language of metaphysics. It's only a pointer. That is, the appearance of the word ereignet is an outpost ventured in the midst of metaphysical language. It's in the margin of the metaphysical language that we have already, preparing us to enter into the thought of ereignis. So I will give the short answer to what's this crossing out to do. I will use this pointer here. I have a puff on my pipe because this is a very dramatic movement. First, just a little explanation, nothing fancy. An investigation into why words do not equal reality. We know that, don't we? We know that by heart. In our ordinary speak, we know that. I know that from philosophy. It does not equal reality. But look what happened. Reality, ereignis, it's blocked out. What happens now? Well, something happens when you put, so to speak, reality with a crossing over. Reality doesn't seem to have, what should we say? I don't want to put too many words into your thinking or your mouth, but it doesn't sort of have essence, reality. We've spoken before about the essence of reality. It has some sort of essence. And if reality has an essence, what happens to the words? Well, they sort of gets less essential, less prioritized, less weighty. And it's this very metaphysical tendency to makes it problematic for words to really mean, because they are sort of lacking their weight all of a sudden. Words trivially, in a trivial way, in a very common sense, when we are engaging things, when we are zuhanden, when you are really doing something in life, when you are, well, take the example for the slate, when you are making a wall, what happens then? It's you are so into the world, you are zuhanden, down into the world, so all of a sudden there is no difference between the word slate and slate. It doesn't make any difference. And this is what I mean trivially. You could also call it banal or vulgar or something. But this is when you are engaged in the doing. You don't make a difference between the word and the thing. If I ask Kalle for the thermos here, he will give it to you. He won't ask is that just the word I utter? He will give the thermos or point to it or something else that has to do with the actual word / thing. But when we are engaged in our language, we have to remember that our language has always been metaphysical. And this metaphysical tendency, he wants to help first himself, because he put it into the margin. He had to help himself first. But then I claim that he already understood. Although in his lifetime that didn't come to his consciousness. But by hand he already had the understanding. And the understanding is the crossing out. The word is still there. It's not taken away because it still has a position in the sentence. It's not the same thing as taking it away. It's a hint to you, a knock on your head. Try to stay within the really close intimacy to the world. Because think of the slate example where two people are making a wall and they're using a slate and they're using beton. These lights are way too just. Think about two people doing a wall, and some philosopher pass by and say, well, there is a difference between the word slate and the actual slate. But he's not involved in the process. Where is the philosopher? He's vorhanden. He's looking at it. He is making the slate into something isolated, not engaged in the process. And all of a sudden, you have this perceived division between word and thing. But actually, when we do things, word and thing are never separated. Otherwise, language would fall, would crash, because word wouldn't mean anything. Because the meaning of termos is termos. It's the same thing. The word and the thing is the same. So this is something that I can say in my case, and I don't know if it goes for everyone. So I softened the ideas for a long time. We started with Heidegger circa 2 years ago, and we started to soften it. We did the thing. It was a doing. We had a whiteboard. We talked about it. That's a doing. Something got established. So it's like a prequel to understanding. And by writing it, by doing the crossing out, you have understanding. That's the only way of gaining understanding, because explaining will never ever do the trick. So you cannot understand because you understand in your metaphysical language. But it doesn't mean, and this is the point of Matthew King here, it doesn't mean that we have to invent a new language. Because language has always already worked. It has never crashed language. It has not happened that people don't understand each other. We don't understand each other. That will never happen. So, in a way, you can't construct another language either. You can't explain, but you can't construct another language. So this is the knock on the head. When you really study the subject, this is the final position. And it also equals the timeline of Heidegger's life. Because late in his life, he had the turn. This is what he was coming to. So it's almost like we are understanding now at the same time as Heidegger himself. And that is not to be forgotten. That is very important part of the whole thing. Another approach is, of course, as we mentioned before, and that approach is not as direct as the thing I showed now or told now. And that is start thinking more in distance and intimacy. And after a while, you get better and better to apply it. For instance, in this example of the philosopher walking by the two people making the wall, notice this. The philosopher is not in the doing. There is a distance. And that distance is both, so to speak, in meters, and a distance in what he's doing. He's not engaged in the whole thing. He's not there, here or here. It's further apart. And that is important too, because that distance is what is the metaphysical part in Western language. Well, it's not a distance in itself. No, it's getting stuck in that distance. It's starting to think that there is only one distance, and it's not a flexibility. Is there a flexibility in used language? Yes, of course there is. Language would not work. We need to do forehand sometimes, and it's like a gradual scale between something that's two-hand and a forehand. I spoke earlier that maybe a first seed of forehand was always already there when the Neolithic man made a wall painting, and they took something out of the context where it was situated. They created a distance, and then they created a new situation. Decontextualization and recontextualization. That's a more roundabout way of doing the same thing as Heidegger, but many ways helps to the understanding. They didn't get stuck in forehand, and were just much later when you can just theorize here. I don't know myself, but I think it could be actually quite a good guess that technology had something to do with that. We thought there could only be one way of looking at the world, and that is at a distance, the forehand. But you are using language close by, otherwise it doesn't work. So there is a doubleness here. What you think you do with your language is not what you actually do. Your language is more or less working. It's not defunct in any way. There's nothing wrong with language. We don't have to cure it, give it a COVID shot or something like that. It got infected by the Greeks. Now language is damned, and Heidegger had to invent a new language. No, he didn't. He had an article, he had 4 dozens of neologisms, but those are helpers and not to be considered as a completely new language. They're going to help you to get a new understanding of where you are yourself situated. You are situated in the metaphysical context of Western languages. If you want to make it even more historical, one can make this timeline much longer. We can begin with Husserl there, because it could be that what was started once by Husserl got terminated by Heidegger. And this is, of course, this tension between what is theoria and what is praxis. And this is a difficult nut to crack. It's not an easy one at all. And once more, think about the people who are doing the praxis of making a wall. That's something you do by hand. But you can also look at it theoretically. We have that possibility to look at it theoretically. And we should do both. We should do practice, we should do theory. It is when we are getting stuck in one or the other. We're usually getting stuck in theory these days. The fourth way of helping you to the understanding, I'm so happy I got to understand it myself and I want to share. But the fourth way is, of course, Feyerabend. He wanted to help science by destroying it. And that's how he expressed it. He said, I want to destroy science. But what he did at the same time was invigorate it. Because what happened in science is that we started to prioritize theory, without a doubt. I think there's very few people who will agree with me on this point. I think there would even be people to say that why? Science is only theory. Well, in this example, it could be a tough one. It does. I don't know if it has a pedagogical value. I think it does have a pedagogical value. It could help, actually. It gets so extreme in science, much more extreme than in ordinary language when we use it. Because in science, they claim today that it has always been theory. Science started as theory, and practice is just a derivation of theory. Listen to this saying, well, it worked in theory, but it didn't work in practice. Often something that people, when they speak about the Soviet Union, they said it was a good theory, but it didn't work in practice. When people say that, they think theory comes before practice, and theory is something better than practice somehow. When it's actually, and this is not even scientific thing, Soviet Union is not a scientific problem. But this comes from science, a confusion that was impossible in the beginning, because it was no difference between theory and practice when the Neolithic man did his decontextualizations. Almost it was hardly any difference between theory and praxis. Still, in the Middle Ages, it started, but that became more and more separated. And when I encountered physics, for instance, I got very interested in physics when I studied in school. I encountered physics as more as theory than practice. We did practical things, but they were more to accompany the theoretical understanding, as the teacher said. And here, of course, Heidegger and Wittgenstein and Feyerabend and Graham Priest would shout, oh no, that's not how it is, not at all. It starts with practice. And if the school would have been more pedagogical, it would be that start with the experiments. And then the teacher should have asked you, hello students, can you construct a theory from what we have just done? Can you step aside a bit? Can you put a distance between what you just sort of discovered with the help of the teacher and now make a theory of that? That sort of pedagogy would make the risk of going into the same problematic pit, a maelstrom, I would say. It's a terrible thing, but it's a misunderstanding. It comes in the wrong order, and the misunderstanding sticks to you. And I think maybe I myself is a really good example, because I never thought it stuck to me. I thought I saw through it. I didn't, because I did it in the wrong order. Just by doing it in the wrong order. They should in school always start with praxis. And a little bit like the Waldorf school does. They start with praxis. First, they learn about mathematics by doing things, putting things together. Then it becomes a praxis first, it gets embodied. The problem with Waldorf and Montessori is when they come to this level of physics, they can't do it anymore, because very few such pedagogical tools have until now been developed. So the teacher needs to be extra careful not to trick the student or some of the students into thinking that theory comes first. In some cases they can come simultaneously, but very, very rarely does it start with theory. And that was Feyerabend's point. And this is also the point that Heidegger proposed, and Wittgenstein. And that is that praxis and theory are both very important. One should not be marginalized, one should not be prioritized. And by doing such, you sort of
make yourself not to understand the world or your language. It affects you first, and maybe only. The misunderstanding is yours. It's your problem. It's not a problem for society. It's sort of a bit of a problem, Feyerabend would say, but it's, according to Heidegger, the problem is yours. You are the one who confuses things. And it's a confusion, as you can hear, it was established, this confusion, by doing things. Therefore, there's no escaping the confusion by explaining. It needs to be done also. It's a matter of doing. Doing something in the wrong order is very pervasive. It's very convincing. Whereas if you hear something, you can acknowledge that and you can nod your head and say, I completely agree. But how strong will your conviction be? It will not be as strong as when you really practice something. That is a lot more strength. Well, I think I'm going to round about there. 4 different approaches to understanding the problem with crossing over ereignis. I wish you good luck with that, and it was really pleasurable, this, and I say thank you very much. And thank you, Matthew King, as well, because you are excellent. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.